Hello everyone, and welcome to what is probably my last Electrodeity deck profile. This is just normal Electrodeities, not lost Electrodeities. The game hasn't been supported in a few years at this point, so I figured get one last deck profile out for you guys, so you guys can mess with your own decks if you want, or at least get ideas. So without further ado, let's get into it. The buddy, well, and the flag is obviously Katana World, and the buddy is Electrodeity of Light Amaterasu. Pretty standard, good Electrodeity. Her call cost is 2 gauge. And once per turn, you choose one of the following two abilities. You can either gain a gauge, get 8,000 power and double attack, or you gain 2 life and draw a card, and she gets 4,000 defense, so she'll be up to 12,000 defense. You'll probably more than likely use the 2 life and draw a card effect more than the gauge effect. um, but yeah, she's just a good solid resource. Also, and I'll kind of show in the deck later, but you with the possessions you do not pay their call cost, since you're essentially equipping an item. So you don't have to worry about the call cost in that regard. Only if you call it from your hand. So starting with the size zeros is Weaver of Dream and Fate, Miko. The item protection effect, her first ability, the item protection effect, is not super used much. Um, but what it is if she's on the field and your item would leave the field, you can sacrifice her to keep the item on the field. But her second effect is the big one, where you can pay a gauge to nullify an attack and then gain 3 life, and you put Miko to the bottom of your deck. This only activates if she's in the discard, in the drop zone. So yeah, good defensive spell. Also, before I forget, one nice thing you can do if you kind of line it up correctly is if you have a Miko in your drop and you have a Miko in your gauge, you can pay the gauge of the Miko in the gauge to send it to the drop. So then you have another Miko to, block another attack. So a little bit of nice synergy with itself. Next up, for size zeros, is 4 copies of Electro Beast Emissary Otora. When she enters the field, if you have another Electro Deity, you gain a gauge and draw a card. Pretty solid, pretty easy gauge advantage, especially for Kagura Electro Deity welcome, but we'll get to that card soon. But yeah, pretty good, and it's not once per turn, so you could just spam summon her a few times if you wanted to. Moving on to size 2s is 4 Guardian Electro Beast Godios. You can only call her once per turn, and when she enters, you check the top 3 cards of your deck, and you put one to your hand. You don't have to show your opponent what you grab because it's just a card, just as long as you show that you're taking a card. But otherwise, yeah. One nice synergy with Godio and Miko is if Miko is one of the cards of the 3, don't select her, don't put her in your hand. Just send her to the drop, and you've essentially gotten her to your hand because now she'll trigger from the drop as an attack null. So, yeah, solid 4 for the deck. I really don't see why you wouldn't run her. Next up is 4 copies of the buddy, Electrodeity of Light Amaterasu. I've already kind of gone over her, but she actually in this deck, you probably when you get your field going, you actually probably won't equip possess into her. There'll be a different Electrodeity you'll possess into, but we'll get to that later. But yeah, just 4 copies of her. Next up is 1 copy of Affectionate Heavenly Deity Amaterasu, a different variant of her. She's pretty costly if you do call her at 3 gauge, but otherwise, at counter speed, you can pay a life, draw a card, and choose to either make her offensive with triple attack and 6,000 power, or defensive with 6,000 defense and counter attack. More than likely, you'll probably be using the offensive with her. The defense is nice, but there's other Electro Deities you'll probably want to possess into, but it's not a bad option. The counterattack is okay, but don't expect that to trigger very often. And the triple attack is really nice, so nothing wrong with that. But yeah, just 1 copy of her. Next up is a more defensive size 3 Electro Deity of Water, Mizu Hanome. She costs 2 gauge if you call her, and choose one of her 2 abilities. You can rest a monster and gain 2 life, or you can bounce a monster and burn your opponent for 1. I want to say most of the time I usually do the rest and gain 2 life, but if you're playing against kind of a more slow deck, you could burn your opponent to death, I suppose. Be probably quite a few turns, but hey, better than nothing. Next up is the last size 3 in the deck. 2 copies of Great Electrodeity of Freedom, Izanami. She costs 3 gauge. Let me get a little bit closer because the text is a little smaller. She costs 3 gauge, but she is probably going to be the main one you will possess into, mainly for her second effect, but I'm getting ahead of myself. The first effect, which I never use for this deck, is Leave It to Me. Choose and use one of the following 2. You can only use Leave It to Me once per turn. During your turn, the first effect is, during your turn, you may drop 5 different size 3 Electro Deities from hand. If you do, you get another turn. That sounds great, but it has to be 5 different Electro Deities, and I only run 4 different in the deck anyway, so you can't even trigger it. Actually, do I run 4? 1, 2, 3. Yeah, I only run 4 different Electro Deities. So, in no way can this happen in this deck. That's not what this deck is for. And honestly, it's kind of more of a gimmick than anything. But the second effect is what really matters. Call a size 3 Electro Deity from your drop without paying its call cost. So all the other Electro Deities are free to call, and they become 0. So you could actually have 2 size 3 Electro Deities on the field that are 0 that you just called for free. And then she just has innate triple attack. So you don't need to use either effect to get the triple attack. So, really, I tend to just call onto her, possess into her every turn. And then, if I'm on defensive, I would probably call Amaterasu or Mizuhaname. Well, yeah, Light Deity Amaterasu or Mizuhaname. And if I'm on offense, I probably would do the Affectionate Heavenly Amaterasu. So, that's kind of where Izanami falls into that. Next up is, we're moving to the item. The very crucial item of the deck. 3 copies of Kagura Bell of Worship. At the start of each player's main phase, you can equip into a size 3 Electro Deity, and it's treated as an item until it leaves the field. At the end of each player's turn, you re-equip this Kagura Bell of Worship, and the size 3 goes back to your hand. And this card on the field and items and its souls can't be destroyed. And if this card is in the soul of an item, it can't be dropped by cards. So just a little bit of self-protection and everything. So, but yeah, this is kind of the whole crux of the whole deck. You kind of need to equip this and then go into Izanami, and then you can call the other size 3 Electro Deities onto the field for free at size 0. So if you don't run the weapon, you basically aren't playing Electro Deities. Next up, we're moving into the spells. First is one of the tutors for the item, Kagura Blossom Dancer. You can only use this card on your opponent's turn. It has one of 2 abilities. You can either equip an Electro Deity item from your deck or drop zone, and if you look at your deck, shuffle it, so that's where you grab the item. And this is nice because if you're the second turn and you don't have Kagura Blossom Dancer, you're going to have to wait until your second turn before... Actually, no, let me rephrase that. You have to wait until your opponent's turn before you can possess into a Electro Deity monster. Where with Kagura Blossom Dancer, if you play this on your opponent's turn, you get this from the deck, you play it. Then at the start of your main phase, then you can already go into a size 3. So Kagura Blossom Dancer helps progress your board state a little faster than it normally would with if you use the other spell, Electro Deity Festival. And then the second effect is the next time you take damage, you reduce it to 0. So it's just a good defensive spell after that anyways. Next up is 2 copies of Miracle Fighters. There's already a decent amount of Electro Deities, size 3 Electro Deities in the deck, and then you already got the 4 copies of the Kagura Blossom Dancer, so 2 Miracle Fighters kind of felt enough that you would see it when you need it, but if not, then you don't, you wouldn't see it and you wouldn't need it. Sounds kind of redundant, but let me say its effect first. Choose an attribute of a card on your field, so you're always going to choose Electro Deity in this case, and you pay gauge, and you can grab either size 3 monster or a item from your deck and add it to your hand. And this also works for the Folktale deck as well. That's why their characters are on here. So yeah, it's good, but I wouldn't say you need 3 or 4 copies. I mean, maybe 3 if you're really struggling with consistency, but 4 copies is kind of overkill. Next up is 3 copies, of Ritual Harvest Prayer. You only cast if you have an Electro Deity on the field. You pay gauge and draw 2. If your Electro Deity item has a soul, so basically you're possessed, you draw 1 more. So just a really good standard draw spell for the deck. Nothing super crazy out of the ordinary. Next is 3 copies of Kagura Electro Deity Welcome. You can only cast it if you have Electrodeity on the field. You pay a life. You gain 3 gauge. Then you can look at your gauge, put 1 card from your gauge to your hand, and then you put the rest of the gauge back down. This works really well with Otora as well. You play a couple of Otoras, you play this, and then you can have a nice like 5 or 6 card gauge to look through and grab whatever you need. The other nice thing too is if you know you have Mikos in the gauge, you kind of can rearrange your gauge to have them be first. So whenever you pay your gauge, the Mikos will go to drop. And if there's a few Mikos, put them successively next to each other. So when you cast 1 Miko and you pay 1 gauge, the next Miko goes in the drop to be used for the next attack and so on and so forth. So it's a really nice kind of resource / pseudo tutor, I guess. Even though it's not technically a tutor, but you can kind of think of it as a tutor. Next is 3 copies of Cross Manner. It's the spell null for Electrodeities. You can only cast it when your opponent casts a spell, and if you have an Electrodeity item with souls, you pay 2, nullify the spell, and your opponent can't play that same spell for the rest of the turn. Just solid spell null. There's not a lot of gauge use in this deck once you get going. I suppose unless you call, really the only gauge use is Cross Manners, the Ritual Harvest Prayer, and Miracle Fighters, but once you get going, there's really not a lot of gauge use. So there should be plenty of gauge for using Cross Manner for spells. So I only run 3 because when I run 4, it feels a little too clunky in the deck. There's just too many Cross Manners with not enough gauge use. So next is moving on to more attack null spells. Soul Aurora. You only cast it if you're being attacked. Nullify the attack, and then if your item has a soul, gain a gauge and a life, and one of the attacking cards that you nullify the attack of can't stand for the rest of the turn. So, really solid, cute artwork, good resource gain. That's pretty much it. It's just attack null. What do you want from it? Next is the last attack null. Freed Flower of Yosen. You only cast it if you're being attacked. Nullify the attack. Then if your opponent's cards attack 3 or more times and you have an Electrodeity item with soul, you end the phase. They move to final phase. They don't get to have their battle phase anymore. So really, really nice effect for free. I mean, obviously I take a few attacks, or just nullify a couple attacks, but that's not a big deal. Next is 3 copies of Windark Deity Uzu Ikazuchi. The deck is kind of, without Uzu Ikazuchi, the deck is kind of lacking some offense. So this card helps with that. So you can only cast it if your Electrodeity item has souls. And for the turn, the crits of all Electrodeities cannot be reduced by your opponent's card effects. And when an Electrodeity item on the field attacks, you destroy a card on your opponent's field and burn for 1. You only cast this once per turn. Keep in mind, the burn is not dependent on a card destruction. So even if there's nothing on the field, you can just, effect burn them for 1. So, Izanami has triple attack, so this should trigger 3 times. Just, the card destruction is nice if it happens, but it's not something I totally rely on. So, yeah, it's just a good, solid spell to help kind of finish a game off. And last but not least is 1 copy of Demon Way Sakura Fubuki. So, basically, there are 4 nulls between the 3 cross manners in the deck. And then the 1 copy of Sakura Fubuki. You gain a lot of life in this deck, so the 1 life or the 2 life cost is really negligible. And this deck is basically why this card was limited to 1 anyway, so it was synergized way too well with this deck. So that's it as far as the main board. As far as the sideboard goes, first we got 3 copies of Cherry Blossom Dance, mainly for the item protection effect. But, I mean, if you can mess with your opponent who wants to call cards from the drop, more power to you. So, just 3 copies of that. Next is 3 copies of, if I can get them in my hands, Loyalty. Just if you are playing against a deck that is really reliant on wanting to summon a whole bunch of cards, a whole bunch of monster cards to gain advantage and stuff and whatnot, this kind of keeps them honest, and, you just say, hey, you can only call 3 cards and you're done. So, kind of slows the opponent down quite a bit. The other effects are nice, I suppose, but it's mainly the monster calling effect that I mainly use this for. So it's only dependent on whatever person you're playing against ultimately. And then last, but honestly probably the most important card of the deck is 4 copies of Grace of the Sun Deity. I'll read this one because this one might be a little less common, but you can choose one of the following 2 effects. For the turn, you can't take damage by card effects, which is okay. That's not what it's here for. But the second effect is you choose a card on your field, and for the turn, the chosen card cannot be destroyed, leave the field, and its soul cannot be dropped or returned to deck by your opponent's card effects. This is meant to try to help keep your item on the field in case of like Lost World, where Husk wants to continuously try to put your item into the drop. Between this and Cherry Blossom Dance, at least you have some options. Cherry Blossom Dance might be for more of like they have 1 or 2 specific cards to do it, where Grace of the Sun Deity is more for if they consistently keep trying to do it, like they have Husks on the field. So yeah, just run 4 of that for protection. And that's pretty much it. Let me know if you have any questions or anything. I'll try to certainly get to them as much as possible, but yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching. Bye.